Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful conversation about the book Eating While Black. Just a few things before we begin. I'm Allison Jones-Turner from Source Booksellers, and we are so happy to discuss this book today and to celebrate its release. We have closed caption if you need it, and you'll see that at the bottom it says CC. So that's the closed caption, and you can have the captions appear, or you can hide them there. If you have questions, you're going to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will be getting to them after the conversation. And so I see that we're coming in. Still coming in. Thank you for your patience and signing up with us. Just to introduce the two conversants today, we have Lindsay C. Green. She's an experienced and accomplished food and dining writer. She currently serves as the dining and restaurant critic for the Detroit Free Press newspaper. Her recent work can be found in the link that we have in your ticket. And before joining the Free Press, she worked at Our Magazine here in Detroit. And before that, Ebony and Teen Vogue had her. So we are very excited to have her in conversation with Dr. Psyche Williams-Forsum today, who is a professor and the chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland in College Park. She's also the author of Taking Food Public, Redefining Foodways in a Changing World, and the award-winning Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power. And you may know that book from our store. Her most recent book is the one we're celebrating tonight, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America. You can follow Ms. Green on the Free Press, and you can also follow our author on Twitter if you'd like. So let's bring them on in.
Hello.
Hello, how is everybody doing?
Well, good evening.
Doing well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We learned about this a little bit before it came out, and we were thinking, oh my gosh, we have so much going on here in Detroit around food. We have a food co-op that's going to be opening, and I'm going to put a little information about that in the chat. We have a food security community that is strong and very active, and so this conversation applies so deeply to some of the thinkers here in Detroit and in the community. So thank you so much. And I'm gonna listen with everyone. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison. Hi, Psyche. I'm so excited to meet you. I don't know, virtually, almost meeting you.
Yes, absolutely. I'm excited, and thank you all for having me. And I'm really excited about the conversation tonight.
Likewise. You know, I would say thank you also for this book. I think I've been making my way through the book, and I think for the first time in a long time in reading a book, I'm feeling challenged. You know, I think a lot of times you can make your way through a book and just sort of coast, but I find myself, you know, every sort of page I'm stopping and I'm having to think. You know, it just makes you really think. It makes you really process. And it really has made me even confront the ways that I have done some food shaming, right? You know, there are many ways, even as a Black woman, that I've said, you know, I don't know, I don't eat chitlins, or like, like just
Mhm.
there are things that we do subconsciously that now I think after reading this book, I will look back or I will moving forward just be a little bit more conscious and be a
Right.
little bit more responsible with my, with my words and my judgments of other people's foods. And so just thank you for that. I think
Good.
it's important that we challenge ourselves as we as we read books like these.
Good, good. Well, thank you, because that's then my work is being done, quite honestly. And I mean, I'm very transparent in the book. And I even reveal, I think to some large degree, my own experience with food shaming. Yeah. I mean, because we all do it. It's what we do. My whole point was to get us talking as we're doing, and also just to get us thinking a little differently. So let's jump in.
Yeah. You kind of just talked about your inspiration, which was obviously going to be my first question, but was there a moment that you thought, okay, now is the time that we need to talk about this?
Right, right. So it was a combination of things. Intentionally, after I wrote Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, I started traveling around the country. And, around that time, a lot of things, like as was said, as Allison mentioned, a lot of things were happening on the food scene, right? So, dollar stores started getting refrigeration, right? And I live near a Dollar Tree, and I would always go down there and get party stuff for my daughter. So that was happening. A lot of people were starting to talk about growing community gardens. So we're in this sort of second, third, or fourth wave of back to the land. Folks started talking about the locavore challenge. And so as I was traveling, I just noticed that as people would come up to me after, and a lot of times they say, how can we start a community garden in this Black neighborhood or in that Black neighborhood or in this place and that place? And I'd always be very curious, because who said that needed to happen, right? Or that you needed to be the one to do it. But then more importantly, I think, and this was across the spectrum, age, race, ethnicity, region, no respect to any of that, there was this real moral tone where people were saying things like, oh my God, how do we get folks to stop eating this? Or how do we get folks to stop eating that? And so over time, I had these different pieces of this conversation. And then in the last year or two, I had a colleague, as I mentioned in the book, who was like, you should just bring it all together. But I couldn't figure out what was really the through line here. And so that kind of came together in the last year, not because of what the summer of 2020, but the summer of 2020 certainly informed my thinking. And I said, a lot of this is rooted in anti-Black racism. It's rooted in anti-Black racism. And I think a lot of Black people have bought into that narrative of shame. Of shame of our culture, of misinformation about our culture, especially our food culture.
Yeah.
Right? Because as you know, I say that I had a really close friend of mine one time say, well, I shared all this information with him. And then he said, well, you forgot one thing. And that is that we used to eat scraps. Well, actually, no, we didn't only eat scraps. Right. And I felt like that was a corrective. That was very similar to the story I tell. I think it's in chapter 3, where I start the chapter with the story of Ham and Noah.
Yeah.
Right. And how for so many years, Black folks have been led to believe that we are the children of Ham. And so we are cursed as a people. That was taught to us during enslavement. Right. And actually, when, I heard a pastor over here in Northern Virginia preach the sermon one time, and he talked about sacralization and how you can take a piece of scripture and twist it so that it fits what you want it to say.
Right.
Well, I think it's the same thing has happened with this narrative around scraps. It has been twisted either to say, we overcomers because we ate scraps, and grandma cooked. And it's a very true narrative, but it's not the only one. And I wanted Black folks to know there are more stories about our food culture. Right. and that we need to be aware of these different conversations in hopes that we can release some of what I am defining and seem to feel is a lot of shame.
Right. Yeah. One quick housekeeping thing. So I see Allison put in the chat that you can throw your questions in here. I also just wanted to let everybody who's watching know that at about 7:45, I am going to open it up to questions. So you will have the opportunity to ask Psyche some questions as well.
Yeah.
But something that there were two things that you just said that just kind of inspired some questions. So one thing, I just wanted to read this from the book because I think this speaks to your point. In chapter, I believe this was in chapter 1, it says, if we start the story with what Africans were given to eat once they arrived on the shores of America, instead of what they ate before they were captured, or how they survived once they got to the Americas, then we will have a different story. And I thought that was such a great, just sort of enlightening line, because it's true. To your point, we latch on to that concept of the scraps. You know, we have been fed that. What is it? What do I say? No pun intended.
No pun intended, right?
We've been fed that line that we have been fed the scraps. But when you actually go before that, we were eating foods that were native to our soil, native to our land, that were, you know, rich in vegetables and nutrients and clean meats and all of that. And I just thought that was such, again, one of those pieces that just made me stop and say, you're right. That's true.
Yeah. And you know, again, and we're seeing this, it's sad because we're seeing this play out right now, right? We don't want to tell you these stories because we don't want to tell you this history because we don't want to feel like the bad guys. Well, in you not feeling like the bad guy, white folks don't want to feel like the bad guys. You're demonizing an entire culture of people, right?
Right.
And so if we understand that enslavement not only was not just in the 1800s, that's part of our problem. Everything we know about enslavement, everything the average person knows about enslavement, because this is what they show on television, Gone with the Wind, kind of, you know, Django, and, you know, it's really 1800s. So that's the 19th century. By the 1800s, we had been enslaved for multiple generations, right? We've been in this country since the 1400s, right? And we have been a part of the Atlantic slave trade, right? Since 1700s. And so that in and of itself was both an enterprise of race and racism, because, hey, we need a labor supply. Let's bring these people over here. They're barbaric. They're this, that, and that. It was both that and it was economic. And so that's the piece that people forget. We were plucked from particular regions of the continent because of our agricultural skill and knowledge and brought to this country, right? African women were put on the ship to, in the words of one sea captain, to dress the victuals, right? So women were brought intentionally to cook on the ship. Right. Okay. So I say all that to say, what were we eating beforehand that we drew the attention of people who wanted us to come and grow tobacco and wanted us to grow cotton and wanted us to grow all these different things, right? So that is knowledge you have to have so that you understand we didn't come here defunct. We came here with knowledge sources. Right. And we brought those sources here. We and indigenous peoples who were here when we arrived are the reason that white colonial settlers were able to survive. Right. As I read recently, they brought, you know, disease. And so they weaponized smallpox, you know, killing off hundreds of thousands of native people to this land. But so we came though with knowledge and equipped with what we saw and what was brought on our ships. Okay, because certain foods were brought on the ship, not to feed, just to feed the labor source, but it was brought for this country's plantation, for planting. So if you understand those stories, then you also understand that there were Muslims, there were folks with indigenous African spiritual practices. Some of them could not have eaten the foods that we talk about as scraps. They would not have, because they continued to practice their religion even though they did it in quiet and they did it under the guise of perhaps being killed. Okay, we resisted, is my point. If you're surrounded by foliage, and I say this all the time, and you're hungry, and you know how to identify berries, why wouldn't you go out in the middle of the night and pick your berries so that you can do what you have to do to feed your children,
right,
or yourself? So we have to think a little bit more in depth about these stories. Black folks hunted, we trapped. If you want to go back to the 1800s, Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington both talk about their mothers finding a chicken or cooking some kind of chicken late at night under the ground so that they could eat. So we were out there burying sweet potatoes. We were doing what we had to do. We didn't just survive off of offal or innards of these animals, right?
Right. That's so true. I love that you said we didn't come here defunct. I think that will stay with me because it's so true. And I think about this a lot. I've recently become pretty passionate about farming and growing your own food and food sovereignty, all of that. And that's something I think about a lot because I hear from people, we didn't come this far to be back in the, back on the land. We didn't come this far to be, slaving and growing food. But I think that's really a shame that some of us have that mentality because we actually should be empowered to know that we are the original stewards of this land, right? But instead, we don't see it that way. We forget about the fact that we were, we were the masters in a way.
We and native peoples know the land. But here's the other thing that I have started saying when people tell me they don't want to grow. And this is part of the other thing I was talking about in this book. It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, here's where we have to be as people. I just finished saying, when we came on those slave ships, we were not the people we are today, obviously.
Right.
We came from tons of tribes.
Right.
And we had to figure out a way to communicate. That's what the roots discussion is about. How do we figure out, because I talk about the contemporary version of the movie Roots, and that scene where one person says a thing and then Kunta says, "Oh, I'm just gonna die. I'm gonna give up and die," and another person says, "No, we need you." Right? Here's my point to the gardening piece. We need folks who can grow, and we need people who can cook. We need people who can trade.
Yeah.
We need people who know how to harvest.
Yeah.
Okay. My point simply is there are different roles that people can play. I'm not a grower, but I can cook. I mean, like I can go in the kitchen right now and take one quick look and be like, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Right.
My mom is always like, yeah, and I grew up watching my mom cook meals, right? Thankfully. But I can do that. She can grow. She grows tomatoes, she can grow collard greens, she can grow, potatoes, she can grow, but I can cook. And that's where I'm trying to push us to.
Right.
It doesn't just have to be, I have a plot of land and I'm going to do this. Can you put something in the egg carton? Okay. Can you put a couple of herbs in it? Okay. If that's not your thing, do you know how to, bang pans? Do you know how to, do you know how to make, I'm not a baker. There are people who are bakers who are not growers.
Right.
The point is food sovereignty needs to look bigger than what we are saying. We are stuck with, it's like we get one narrative and we stick with it and we run with it.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
and anybody who doesn't follow that narrative is being shamed. And I'm like, no. Right. Not everybody can do that. It's fine if you want to, and we should. But let people join where they are.
Right.
Not everybody can be a vegan. Not everybody can be a pescatarian. Not everybody can eat meat. Not everybody wants to do those things. But let people join where they are, because when we stop people from joining where we are, we take away their power.
Right.
And now we're moralizing.
Right.
So, and we're somehow saying, I'm on a different plane than you are because I'm more enlightened, or what. We all enlightened in something.
Right, in some way.
Some way, right?
Yeah.
And so I like for us to start having a conversation where it's like, okay, if you don't want to grow, if I bring you this eggplant, can you whip me up some, because I could grow eggplant and not know a thing. And I see it all the time on Facebook. I'm in all those growing groups, right? But you sometimes have people who are like, I have no idea what to do with this.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
It kind of sums up, the first chapter, which is, or maybe that was the intro, but worry about yourself.
Worry about
Like,
yourself.
worry about
Right.
yourself. You don't
Right.
need to be concerned with what I'm doing over here. But also I'm hearing you also, just say it's this concept of community. We all have something to bring to the table, and we need to kind of, leverage that together.
That's
And
right.
I hear
And
that.
we should be okay to do that. Now, here's what I'm really saying. We need to let Black people find joy where they can find joy.
Right. Yep.
You know what I'm saying? Because
Yep.
part of our liberation is intimately tied to what brings us joy.
Yep.
All right. One of my girlfriends, sister scholar, said, why are we so caught up in watching Black people eat? And I said to her recently, I said, you know what it's about? And I thought about this after one of my doctoral students wrote about how Black women who come directly from undergraduate to grad, from a majority white university, how did they find joy in grad school, right? Okay. Yes. And I started thinking, I'm like, when you deny us the ability to be ourselves, whether it's singing, dancing, growing, eating, you're taking away our joy.
Right.
And one of the ways to keep people bound is to keep them unhappy and dissatisfied and believing in one story about themselves. That's where some of that oppression comes from. It's like,
Right.
wait, I don't want you being free. I don't
Right.
want you expressing yourself any way you want. So part of what I'm suggesting is when we see each other as community members, each of us having a role to play, we allow people to work to their strength. We allow people to express and give their joy in ways that they can.
Right.
Now, if Black folk get liberated through joy, we can shake this nation all the way up. Talk about shake the table. We can shake this whole nation. But as long as you can keep me bound by all these stories and images I see, eating watermelon, eating chicken, now you keep me locked in a very fragile state of discomfort and dis-ease.
Right.
Dis-ease, which is disease.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that also speaks to something which you touched on a little while ago, which is power dynamics. And I kind of was thinking about power dynamics again. It was right out the gate as I started reading this book, and it really made me think. I recently wrote a piece about diversity or the lack thereof in Detroit and within Detroit's dining scene. And what I noticed was that in a predominantly Black city, Detroit is nearly 80% Black. You walk into the dining room and you see all white faces. And that's jarring in a city like this. And so, I just kind of shared my observation, offered some, sort of tips for restaurateurs on how we can how they can work on that, and create just more inclusive spaces. But reading your take on kind of power dynamics really made me think that for a white restaurateur to come into a predominantly Black city, a predominantly Black neighborhood, and start serving foods that don't resonate with the community at all, in an environment that doesn't speak to the community at all, without engaging the community at all, really is a form of power. It's a real form of enforcing their power, their entitlement, their, white privilege. And I hadn't thought about it that way. When I say it out loud, it sounds pretty obvious, but I hadn't really thought about it that way until reading your take on power dynamics, which was really interesting.
Thank you. It's really a demonstration of systemic power. We heard a lot in the last couple of years about systemic racism. And I had a friend who said, what does that even mean? And I'm like, it's when you see power dynamics, privilege edged in and woven through everyday life. Everyday life. Somebody had to give those folks a permit. Somebody gave them a liquor license.
Right.
Somebody even heard that they wanted to buy that real estate. Right. And we know Black folks in this country have been experiencing, redlining, and ever since I talked about the Black women of Gordonsville selling chicken at the train, who had their permits denied, who had their all kinds of mishaps happen. This has always been our challenge, right? Trying to get our business up and running. And if we're not serving soul food, we're not real chefs, right? Because, that's allegedly all we can cook.
Right.
And so those challenges are at every level. I had the good fortune of talking with the sister chef up in New York. And she said, I'm just trying to make it as a caterer. I'm trying to just do weddings. I'm trying to do this. She was like, because the structure around restaurateuring, as we know, right, is just so fraught with so many different things.
Right.
Yes, of course, that's about power.
Right.
Even in the thing that we ingest. So here's how because I know we have 15 minutes and then we're going to wrap up. Here's another thing that I try to share with people. And I feel like I have to say this, and I say it often, but I want it to be very clear. I'm not saying you don't need your doctor. Absolutely you do. We should be taking care of our health in that way and our well-being.
Right.
If your doctor is saying you need to be on high blood pressure medicine, then you need to take that, right? And eat according to how they have advised you to eat because you want longevity, right? So be clear that's I'm absolutely saying that. At the same time, I need for us to go back to something I just said about Black joy and liberation and dis-ease. Food is not going to save us.
Yeah.
I don't care what you tell me. You can't convince me. I've been studying food for 25 years. It's not going to save us. You can eat the best diet in the world and be Ahmaud Arbery and find yourself on the other end of 2 shotguns while you're out improving your health. Because of the color of our skin. We are being haunted every day. You can eat the best diet and be Breonna Taylor and be awakened in the middle of the night or in the middle of the morning and shot dead. Right? You could be Sandra Bland stopping at a stop sign. So what am I saying there? When we also just be, we have bullseyes and targets on our back. How does food resolve that? So while we're out shaming each other, you should be doing it, girl, don't eat that, don't do that, duly noted, and I'll have that conversation with my physician, or my body will tell me I don't feel good eating that. I'm constipated, I'm feeling too phlegmic, I feel I can't move, I got too much inflammation, let me look. Yes, those are very real things to deal with. But changing those things in order to enhance and improve our life ways is not the only part of health. What about my mental health? What about my emotional health? What about my cultural health? What about the fact that I'm an immigrant and I'm in a whole new country and the only thing that will sustain me are the foods I ate before I left, but they're telling me that's not good for me because I'm pregnant and the calories, they can't calculate the calories. So therefore I can't eat my fufu, or I can't eat, TZ, or I can't eat whatever it is I'm used to eat, my yam. I can't eat those things.
Right.
So I just would like for us to think a little bit more holistically, and let's stop having conversations that draw upon very simple narratives that are by and large undergirded by anti-Black racism and anti-Black joy.
Right. Right. Yeah, that is so true. One of the things I wanted to go back to is that you did mention, you mentioned roots and you mentioned there were some other forms of entertainment that you mentioned in the book, like what was the other one? Boardwalk Empire. Yeah,
The
and
Wire.
The Wire. Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Tell me why you kind of draw from entertainment to, thread these ideas.
Well, my folks call me a culinary historian, and that's fine. But really, my first love and my real study is of the material world, how Black people engage with things. And food is a set of things, right? And one of the places that we get so much of our information today is social media. We also get it from popular culture. We get a lot of our information as well from, periodicals in the news and literature. I draw from all of it. It's, so when I'm watching TV, unless I'm watching the Bourne Ultimatum, which probably won't have any Black folks in there
Probably not.
talking about food. I just happen and I see these things, I'm like, wow. And I felt like the examples that I had used, now Jennifer Wallach, one of my colleagues, she talks about the scene from from Boardwalk Empire as well. But when she started talking about it, I had seen it as well and was like, oh my God, this scene. And so that's why I took it a little further back, because the dynamics in the Black community helped to set up that entire dinner scene where Chalky White feels belittled. It didn't just start at the table. Right. And I wanted folks to think about that, not only from an entertainment point of view, because popular culture is easy to relate to often, but that there are other narratives and stories in there that I wanted people to think about that help to contextualize what was happening. Same is true of The Wire. Those young people, the whole season was about the young people in their middle school. And that one particular scene when they go to Ruth Chris, because many of them have won this award in class, was a very powerful scene for what happened and didn't happen. Everything down to, how young people carry on, right? And how we do the dozens. No, I hated the experience. I hated it, Mom. I hated it. Whoever, don't be bringing me here. Next day, it's y'all should have been there because for real, So and so what I wanted us to see is the ways in which these things happen in very everyday situations, because these were everyday situations. And there are many I could have drawn from, many. But I had been working with those ones for a long time. There's another film and novel that I didn't touch on because I'm going to write another piece on it individually, but it stars Monique and Whoopi Goldberg and Danny Glover. And it's called Good Fences. And it was a Spike Lee piece that was independent, but it's fascinating for the movement of Black people from the South to New England in the 70s. And so the class dynamics that happen, but at the same time, the racism that happens, and the very person that they want to shun, who is Monique, who happened to move to Connecticut because she hit the lottery. And so how she acquires her wealth is very different from how they acquired their wealth. She's the only person who some of the characters can relate to on a very down home level. And so I'll do something with that. But I'm saying we get these narratives all the time. Twitter, IG, I'll say this last thing really quickly. I came across a piece on Twitter a couple of weeks ago where there were a group of substantially full-figured Black women. And it was called Swim Thick. And these Black women were having a great time if you look at the picture, and the amount of vitriol that they experience from people calling them all kinds of names, and you're unhealthy, you're obese. It made me think, sadly, of, Lizzo and the kind of experiences that she has had online. And I'm like, why are we doing that to each other? Because if those had been white women in the pool, you either would have scrolled by, because I've seen this, or you would have said, yeah, that's not my thing, or, one or two things. But they came for those Black and Latino women like it was nothing. What makes us do that to each other? A lack of Black joy, and having bought into these narratives of single stories of who we are as a people, and that we're undesirable, and that we are unhealthy, because we don't conform to a standard version of beauty.
I think that example that you just gave was really interesting, because when you think about food shaming, and maybe for a lot of people who are on this stream right now, when you think of food shaming, I think that's what you think of. You think of those aggressive forms of bullying, and those aggressive forms of just antagonizing full-figured women, Black women, and full-figured women as they're eating also, right? Like that's what I think of with food shaming. But I thought what was really interesting in the book was that you also talked about these smaller sort of microaggressions in a way, you know, that there was one line where you talked about, you know, Black people that kind of say, we don't eat pumpkin pie. And I've done that and I've heard that. And, you know, or we don't eat our grits with, you know, sugar on top, you know, which
What's
by
wrong
the
with
way
you
I do.
people?
But, you know, I
Yes.
think that's also really, really interesting. And it's kind of enlightening because we don't think of those as forms of food shaming.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it really depends upon the context, right? I talk about my own experience of food shaming. One of my best friends, right? Me and another friend, we laughed so hard when the third friend, after they had done all this preparation, we don't eat pork, so we didn't have the sausage, but the third friend tried and was like, I just kielbasa, you know, and we just, you know, fell out laughing. Well, later when I was talking with her in an interview for this project, she said, I know, I was so hurt. She was like, because we had prepared for weeks. And you know, that broke my heart because we thought nothing of it. And so my point simply is this: people food shame. Every culture is food shamed. Absolutely. Every culture is food shamed.
Right.
We tend to get it more than any other culture. And I can say that unequivocally, having studied the imagery around Black people in chicken, around Black people in watermelon, around the ways in which the stories that get told about our food cultures always, always, always are negative. At the same time, our lexicon of food tends to be very much Southern.
Right.
Southern food makers tend to use a lot of, you know, ingredients that are heavy with butter and oil and up until recently, right? When we started sugar, you know, until recently, and many still do, right? Rely upon old recipes and also upon ingredients that we did not for a long time have access to.
Right.
Sugar was not something that Black folks had access to. We harvested it, but it wasn't for us. You know, so knowing these histories, tipping, that's a whole nother conversation, right? But tipping, which is basically relatively new for Black folks. We have to remember it wasn't until the 60s that we experienced integration. That's only been 60 years.
Right.
And so you're talking about maybe 2, maybe 4, but generally 2 to 3 generations.
Right.
Maybe 2 generations, actually.
Right.
2, 3.
So
so when folks are like, y'all don't tip, what are you talking about here? What are we talking about? So we don't give each other time. We talk as if nothing in our lives and experiences are elastic. Everything is right now because I learned it today, so it's right now. As if these things are devoid of historical context, and as if the chain does not remain the same, and that we're not in a cipher of cyclical things happening over and over. They just look different, which is why I love that quote from Blink in Brick City. Is that what it was? I forgot the name of the movie, but Blink said, we've always been in Katrina. It just has a different name. Right? He's like, we have always experienced Katrina. It just has a different name. And I was like, you know what? In that whole movie, I was like, you have never lied. Right? Because part of what was happening is they could not get on their feet. These young people, they couldn't. It was like climbing up a slippery pole. And the more they tried to do something. His wife tried to go and get assistance, but she couldn't because she made like $10 over the threshold, and she was only making like $19,000 for a family of 3. So you know, it's that repeated sense of trauma that I talk about in the book. Those repeated senses of trauma through economics, through racial violence, through police violence, these aggressions, as you said, that we experience on a daily basis, they mount up. How ludicrous is it then to think food is the thing that's killing us?
Right.
Food, because many people let them tell it. It's like food alone is the thing that's killing us. As if we don't experience the vicissitudes of life on a daily, minute by minute basis.
Yeah, I'm glad you also just mentioned Katrina, because that was something that stood out to me in the book. And it's something that's been on my mind in recent months, which is this I love that you asked the question, where is food in the conversation about Katrina? Where does food come into this? And, you know, as someone who is a food writer, that's something I think about a lot, where I think, okay, here's what's going on in the world and how does food relate? And one thing I've been thinking about lately with all of, I mean, everything is going on in the world right now, but especially with, you know, the latest overturning of Roe v. Wade. And I've just been thinking, where does food come into this conversation? And I'm just curious, maybe you don't have an answer to this now, but is that something you've been thinking about? You know, what role does food play in this conversation? How could this affect food? It's just something that's been on my mind.
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit more because it is in there.
Yeah.
It's in there. I want to say two really quick things. First, I want to correct the title. That movie is Cutthroat City. And the Katrina movie is Cutthroat City.
Okay.
But I want to say that, you know, I have thought about Roe, and I have to think a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
And because I do have some ideas, and so let's talk more, because I don't have it right off the top of my head.
Okay.
But I do want to talk. But I want to mention something about the white supremacist shooting in Buffalo, which may help get us thinking about this, right? When that happened, and I heard that it was in the Black community, I thought, okay, I hope it's not on Jefferson Avenue. And I went to the news, and of course, it was on Jefferson Avenue, because I grew up in Buffalo.
Okay.
For 10 years, the first 10 years of my life, I was in Buffalo, and we used to shop at that Top supermarket, right? And one thing that a colleague of mine and I were talking about, and she was like, so, you know, that violence, it does something to your physical body. Also, now that you have a whole community without a place to buy food. I think Tops just reopened, right? But so in those waning months, where did people access food?
Right.
How did they access food?
Right.
So here's the way that I kind of tie this thing into Roe in a way. You know, and folks are gonna get mad at me about this, but I'm a believer that sex is not just about procreation. It's also about joy and freedom and liberation and enjoyment. Right? And why are women being penalized for experiencing joy? You see, some of those women won't be able to carry that baby to term anyway. They won't. But and so they will experience a miscarriage or repeated miscarriages. And now you're dealing with scar tissue and other kinds of things. Some of those women, their children won't, if they have the baby and carry it to term, the child won't be able to latch on. Right. And so you're not able to breastfeed. And then you're dealing with the shame of being labeled a bad mother in some instances.
Right.
So I would say that those are some of my preliminary thoughts around that, because the issues go so very deeply.
Right.
All the way to having children and are like, you know, now what? I read this piece in the Washington Post. I'll say this and close out, but I read this piece in the Washington Post a while ago that said, should we be giving it was many years ago, should we be giving fertility treatments to poor women? It was a very provocative question. And so you can, in this day and age, ask the same question. Should we be asking women, you know, to have children if they are not capable of caring for them?
Right.
So, and part of that caring, of course, we know is how you access food.
Right. Right.
It's how you access food, because not everyone lives in spaces where food is readily accessible.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Those are some of the things that were kind of top of mind for me too, you know, thinking about breastfeeding, thinking also about what it means in the foster care system, what it means in adoption, you know, or what it means even for children who are born to women who are not necessarily prepared to feed their children. But yeah, we can talk about that more. That's
yeah,
just,
let's talk. Yeah, because I have some more thoughts. Right. I have some more thoughts on that I'd be happy to share with you. And I would love to hear from you as well.
Okay, that sounds great. Really quick, I know I said we would open it up to questions at 7:45. I do just have two quick questions that I wanted to make sure we touch on. One thing is, you talk about food apartheid. You kind of touch on it, but you say that, it's more than just, we need to be talking about more than just access, which I think is a really great point, but it's something that's all we talk about. We just talk about food access, it's just hand in hand, food access and food apartheid, or whatever people have called it, food desert. And I just wanted to touch on what is the other part of the conversation that's missing?
To me, the other part of the conversation that's missing is gender, it's race, it's class, it's age, it's so many sexualities, different variables. Let me give you an example. One, I'm very solidly middle class, and I lived in an area that the only way I could access a grocery store was to drive. And when I had to have surgery at one point, wasn't able to drive, and no one could walk to the store for me. That's when I discovered, back then it was called Peapod, Giant and Peapod. Right. So that speaks to a couple of different things. It speaks to access, but it also speaks to transportation.
Right.
And it speaks to gender, because my then husband was not, seemingly incapable of going to the store to handle this, because that was an area that was very solidly in my domain, unless he was going to a West African grocery store. Right. So here now you have class, you have transportation, you have access, you have gender dynamics, you have a number of different things. Another quick example, both my parents have access to food, but they often don't eat, as what happens with many elderly people, especially those who may be alone or living alone. They could have access to food.
Right.
Meals on Wheels. And I teach a class on food trauma and sustainability. And we do a project where our students work with the community. And one of the communities we worked with was Meals on Wheels. And the stories we heard by way of a lot of the volunteers who were themselves elderly, they were like, oftentimes the only person an elderly person sees is the one who's delivering this food from Meals on Wheels. But they won't eat because there's no companionship.
Right.
Or they're only eating by TV. So I'm saying, when we think about food desert, we think about a physical structure. How do you get food? But then what about people who can access food, but for various other reasons, they still go food insecure?
Right.
Another thing that I talk about is using dollar stores, bodegas, corner stores, and such as options and alternatives. And that's in my chapter, Eating in the Meantime. And I did that because I was on a panel where one of our panelists worked with elderly clients, and she said, a lot of my folks go food insecure mid-afternoon or mid-month because they've run out of money. So if you can go to the dollar store and get 10 or 12 things, why are we shaming people for using that as a food option?
Right.
We could all preach to the choir about how we need to change the agro-industrial. Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, folks are passing away because they are not eating.
Right.
Not taking their medication.
Right.
So I'm just saying again that these are, I feel, conversations that need to be expanded. We don't want to just hole in on one thing and just talk about access, because access means different things to different communities of people.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. Okay, my last question, and then I will open it up to questions. I know we have a few in the chat. Is just as a takeaway for everybody who's watching, how can we be graceful in the way that we talk about food, in the way that we respond to people's food choices? Maybe we shouldn't be talking at all. Maybe it's don't say anything.
No, I think absolutely we should talk. Here's what I would like to suggest for people. Remember that we're all human, and that perhaps what we should be doing is walking very gently through this earth. How we treat the planet, how we treat our fellow people, how we treat animals, Okay. Food decisions are not just what you see in front of a person. 9 times out of 10, the person who's eating has gone through a range of conversations in their head to decide upon what, when, where, how, and why they're eating what they're eating.
Right.
You're just privy to one, and that's what you see.
Right.
And maybe hear if they're smacking or whatever. Okay. But understand that that person as an individual has gone through a complex range of questions and machinations in the same way that all of us do.
Right.
To decide to get to the point A or point B. Food decisions are not easy, ever. Oh yeah, I'm just going to make some carrots. But that means that may be how you think about it, but that means there was a process in place that got you there. You had to think about what to buy. Do you have the money to buy it? Where are you going to buy it from? How are you going to prepare it? There's a whole range, like I said, of things. And if we start to see food in that way as way more complex than what we give it credit for, I think just that question alone, what was that going through that person's mind when they made that decision? It could be a number of things.
Right.
And understand that you make the same kinds of choices and decisions every day. The fact that we may come up with different answers doesn't make mine any less potent than yours.
Right.
And so I think it's a lot about respect. It's a lot about minding our own business. And absolutely, I think it's about Black liberation and remembering it's what gives you joy as well.
Right.
And if you walk away from that conversation, you might want to ask yourself, did I take away that person's joy? Did I add to their joy in that conversation? And if you didn't, you probably should have many seeds.
I love that. I love that. And, I actually don't know the origins of the terms, but I would imagine that soul food and comfort food mean just that. Like, this is for our soul, this is for our comfort, and who are you to judge what makes me happy?
Some people, comfort food is popcorn. Other people it's mashed potatoes. Soul food was originally a political term coined by Amiri Baraka, who before he converted, he was Leroy Jones, and he was responding to a Black newspaper report that said Black people had no culture. He said, sure we do. Black people express soul.
Right.
Our soul is in how we move. Our soul is how we talk. Our soul is how we look. Our soul is in our clothing. Our soul is in our food. And let me show you what it looks like.
I love that.
Okay. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. We can talk forever, but I will now open it up to questions. Yep. All right. Let's see. So we have a few questions in the queue. First question is, does Psyche offer any classes or study seminars virtually to those of us not enrolled at her university, but willing to pay to enroll?
Thank you for that question. I have done some classes with the Rosenbach Museum virtually through the Rosenbach is in Philadelphia. And so if you would email me, I'd be happy to add you to their list and encourage them to offer. I just finished teaching a course last spring, I think it was, or over the course of last year. But I would be happy to encourage them to offer another course and add people to the list who might be willing to sign up. So thank you for that.
Okay. Next question is, aren't most nutritionist critiques applicable to a wide range of ethnic foods, not just to those of Blacks? For example, a lot of German food is not heart healthy. Chinese food may have MSG, etc. Help me understand why nutrition analysis is not neutral from an ethnic and racial perspective.
Great, thank you for that question. And let me give you the Cliff's Notes version because it's a longer answer. Nothing is neutral. Okay, because we're human and we all are composed of our own identities, whether racial and ethnic, class, sexual, and the like. Okay, nothing is ever neutral. Please don't buy into that concept. We come to everything with our own thoughts, and it's very difficult to suspend those thoughts. Here's the difference between ethnic communities and Black people. Black people have a long history in this country of being demonized, ridiculed, castigated, whatever word you want to use, all the time around our food practices. Okay, since the advent of technology, which would allow greeting cards, sheet music, you know, all kinds of postcards. And I talk about this in my first book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs. The amount of images that are out there that you can right now Google Black folks and chicken and you'll see all kinds of stuff. All right. We have undergone a continuous onslaught. Well, it's not as if nutritionists are coming to these conversations blind, right? Or unaware, even though people may say, I don't know why we serve watermelon during Black History Month. We don't know where that came from. Really, you know, yeah, you may not know, but you know you picked it up from somewhere. So my point simply is this. Yes, lots of foods are unhealthy or have too much. Any food can be unhealthy. Broccoli can be unhealthy if you cook it in a particular way, right? So part of what I share with nutritionists is understand cultural differences and cultural preferences, right? So that when you're talking about demonizing and telling people this is bad, this is not good for you, you understand perhaps why people may be inclined to eat certain foods in combinations as they do. It could be part of cultural tradition. It could be part of social conditions. It could be part of a number of different things that nutritionists absolutely should be aware of before and when they are doling out that kind of feedback.
Right. All right. Where do we eat? Is it a common practice to eat in particular places? Is shaming there?
Yes. Again, I would just say that's a longer answer, but I talk about this a lot in Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, that there are a lot of Black folks who will not eat certain foods in public, namely chicken wings. You know, it's like, I had one woman who said, I would never eat chicken at my desk at work. It's so ghetto. And yet, if you work in the federal government in the DC area, we all have cafeterias, or many of them have cafeterias, and often they serve a variety of foods, fried fish, you know, collard greens, mac and cheese, foods that, again, speak to a particular cultural have a particular cultural resonance. But a lot of Black folks also have said, I will not eat watermelon in public, especially if it's not cut up. So yes, there's a lot of shaming there as well. And it works both ways. I mean, we laugh about raisins in the potato salad, you know, and so forth. But the reality is that's not how Black people eat potato salad by and large, right? So there is a lot of shaming in a lot of these places. And that's why sometimes you just won't see Black folks eat food in public that may require their hands. You know, a lot of Africans eat a lot of food with their hands, but they may or may not eat them unless they're in their own enclave, because of the fact that they may be deemed barbaric by people who are unfamiliar with folks eating foods with their hands.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to the shortage of baby formula and racial dynamics, differential access to formula during this crisis, and inflexible WIC policies during the crisis?
Thank you for that question. I cannot. In the time that's allotted here, all I can say is that if you have been following the conversations around Black maternal health, these conversations around baby formula are very much tied to the experiences that Black women have around Black maternal health. There's an incredible set of reading out there on WIC policies and their flexibility, inflexibility, who doles out those policies, right? Policies get made often at a very high level, but it's how it get executed on the ground. For example, here in Prince George's County, we experienced this quite a bit with women who are on public assistance or state assistance, how the ways in which the state intervenes in Black people's lives that does not benefit Black maternal health. That's the best I can tell you right now, which may not answer your question at all, but I'm happy to talk about it later as well.
Okay. Thank you for this fascinating conversation, and greetings to my colleague Psyche. I appreciate that you underline the technological know-how about agriculture, especially in places where the climate and environment were similar to that of West Africa, such as rice in the low country of South Carolina, Georgia. I wonder if your book deals with the discourse about return to the South, or what Stephanie Dunning calls pastoral return of African Americans. Do you address regional differences, for example, discourses around found in the urban North versus rural South?
Thank you for that question, Hillary. Girl, no, I had to get the book published. No, I didn't have time to deal with that. But no, I try to, what I do is point you to those sources that are out there that do have a more authoritative voice around those issues about returning to the South. Natasha Bowen has an incredible book where she talks about different kinds of farmers and their return to the land. Again, it's happening, right? We have been having a very a push for some time now from the urban north to the rural south. People want to get back to what they connect with a slower way of life, perhaps a more arduous way of life, because gardening, farming is not easy, right? And so I don't deal with it, but I reference, for example, as I mentioned, those Facebook websites that I'm on where these conversations are taking place, in order that someone else can pick up this conversation and run with it. My goal was to open up the conversation. And I'm hoping that I've done that in a way that so many other people can take it and run with it and talk about the many, many, many things out there that we have to talk about around Black food that doesn't just involve Southern food.
Okay. I love the point about all of the considerations that go into making a decision about what food to eat. Okay.
Thank you.
That was great. Does money and food in Black areas and markets have to do with the bottom dollar or racism, forcing people to shop in other areas of town so our dollars go out of the neighborhood? Not being able to shop and buy food leads to fear and depression, especially the elderly. It takes away their independence.
Yeah, I think you answered the question, Ms. Earl. I think you absolutely, it's both. I never believe in just either or. It's both and. It's racism, it's about markets, and it's about the dollar. We live in a capitalist society. The bottom line is, where can we get the most bang for the buck? This is one of the reasons why I encourage people to not limit where and how people access food. For example, I live within proximity of about 3 or 4 different farmers markets. I probably, on average, I don't go to any of them because I rarely can afford the food that's there. I rarely can afford it. The first time I went, I took like $50 and I thought, oh, I'm gonna be able to get this done. I made it through half of a quarter of a vendor.
Wow.
I was out of money. And I'm talking getting a couple of peaches and stuff like that. I'm from rural Virginia, so I'm used to roadside markets where you can get a whole thing of peaches for nowadays, maybe $5, $10, $5, $6. That would give me about 7 to 8 peaches, not 1 or 2.
Right.
So I don't begrudge folks who are at farmers markets. I know they come a long way and they harvest a lot of different things, but I also know that sometimes farmers markets are carrying things that you can get in the grocery store. And I've had this experience because I went to one of my local markets, thought I was going to get strawberries. I looked at it, it said Driscoll's. I was like, what? I could get these at the, and they said, well, yeah, we have Driscoll's because strawberries aren't in season right now down in North Carolina or in Maryland. So again, I mean, you know, I talk about this in the book. I give an entire read and run through of an experience I had at a farmer's market that was placed in a community, supposedly to serve the Black community. Not a single vendor except one was of color, and that person was selling worms. None of the foods that were there looked identifiable to me. You know, grass-fed beef and so forth, it's fine, but it's also usually $11, $12 a pound. And if you're on EBT, I couldn't figure out what anybody that I knew would be eating there. What I didn't see, and I talk about this and I call it, there was no Black food energy. There were no sweet potatoes, no cabbage, no, you know, rutabagas, no lima beans, you know, there weren't the things that we tend to know and be comfortable cooking. Every single vendor, or at least not every single one. I'd say 3 out of 7 vendors, 7 out of 10 vendors maybe had kohlrabi, and that's fine. But I'm not sure that most Black folks know what kohlrabi is. Most people don't know what kohlrabi is or how to cook it. So
right. Yeah, it's very similar here in Detroit. Even at our biggest farmers market in the city, there are very few Black farmers, but It's another thing. When a Whole Foods grocery opened up in Detroit for the first time a few years ago and proved to be very popular, I found myself feeling worried that Detroiters were needlessly overspending on overpriced food. Maybe there's a good reason. Many Detroiters prefer the organic foods they can get at a place like Whole Foods as opposed to a local grocer or a dollar store. But is there a chance some of the attraction to Whole Foods stems from the kind of food shaming we're talking about?
Yes, that's a possibility. Also, people might, first of all, let me just be clear with you. There are studies that say organic food is organic food. That's fine. I would rather you eat vegetables and fruit than to say I have to have organic, because if all you have access to is frozen, you know, do I want you to eat the vegetables or do I only want you to eat organic? That was number one. Number two, people shop at Whole Foods because Whole Foods is beautiful. The foods are lovely looking, the colors are bright and brilliant, the floors are clean, right? And you know, I think we have to be very mindful that's a marketing ploy, right? Whether you're at Whole Foods or now Amazon, the bakery is fresh, you know, the meats look the colors that they're supposed. That's a very different ball game from many communities where you go in, the floors are cracked, they're dirty, the lights are flickering, and this is a very real experience for a lot of people, right? I'm not suggesting either that you need to eat at the Whole Foods or the dollar store. If you read the book, you'll find I talk about at least one Black woman in Philadelphia who calls herself the Dollar Diva. And she talks about how she prepares for her mom, and she will get certain things from a dollar market, but other things she will get from either a farmer's market or an Aldi is what I think she says. So my point is, again, I like for us not to think in terms of dichotomies, either or, but what are the many ways that Black people and people in general can access food so that they can thrive and live out the lives that are going to make them most happy and increase their wellness in a very rounded way, as opposed to the ways in which some of us feel like other people should be living.
Right. All righty, those are all of our, oh, looks like we just got one more. Lindsay, could you highlight some of the important and exciting Black food initiatives happening in Detroit? Oh, there are a lot. Yeah, we don't have that much time, but I'll give you a couple. I think we might have put it in the chat, but there's the Detroit People's Food Co-op that's coming. That's a community-owned grocery store that's coming to the city of Detroit, which is really exciting. There's another grocery store that's going. So that one is going to be, I think that's in New Center, I want to say. There's another community-owned grocery store that's going to be opening up in Jefferson Chalmers also. So it's really exciting to me, again, being passionate about food sovereignty, being passionate about supporting the local agricultural industry in Detroit. So it's exciting to see things like that happening. Obviously, lots of new restaurants, but I think what's exciting about the restaurants that have been opening over the past year, maybe past 2 years during the pandemic, is that they're restaurants that are really intentional and really, you know, they're committed to doing something good for the community. You know, they're not just opening the, you know, the kind of restaurants that we've talked about in this chat, which is just coming into a neighborhood and trying to, you know, just serve what they've been wanting to serve, you know, their whole lives. It's restaurants that are really trying to be community minded in terms of, there are some restaurants that have been triple bottom line, which is really cool. There are women owned restaurants. We're seeing a lot of minority owned restaurants. We're seeing, you know, me being from New York, coming to Detroit, I didn't see that many, as much of a variety of restaurants as I was hoping for, again, especially in a city that is predominantly Black. But I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing, you know, more African restaurants, which we hadn't seen before. And there are different types of African restaurants, which really gives you kind of, again, this holistic view of, you know, African culture and seeing it as a continent and not, you know, just, you know, just, yeah, exactly. Not just Nigeria. Right. Exactly. Exactly. So we're seeing different parts of the diaspora, which I think is really cool. But yeah, there's lots. You guys can email me and I can share even more.
Awesome.
There's one more.
Oh, it's another. I was just going to wrap up, I think, because I see that our source bookseller is back online here.
There is one last one, just
question?
from Janet. It is, thank you, Psyche, Lindsay, and Source Booksellers for this opportunity to think, oh, sorry, just a comment, just to think, open our eyes and ears and consider, and also, yes,
Good.
thank you,
Thank
Janet.
you. So I just say thank you again to you all, to the audience. Thank you. I appreciate your questions. Thank you for supporting my work. You know, I'm really, I wrote this book because I felt like things were happening that made me sad for Black people, for my people. I'm about Black liberation. I feel like there's so few places that we can obtain joy. And when we, you know, find ourselves in these rigid boxes of what we should and should not be doing, and not even realize that it's actually stressing us out to live this particular way, that makes me sad. One of the things that give me the greatest pleasure is going to a predominantly Black farmers market. Because I know I'm going to get music, I'm going to get incense, I'm going to get jewelry, I'm going to have some good conversation, I'm going to have some great food to my eyes, because we eat first often with our eyes, as the West African proverb says, right? We feast with our eyes first, the colors, all the, and so I just want to encourage people today, as you leave, reclaim your joy around food, reclaim your joy, do what your doctor says, absolutely, do what your body says, but also find your joy. And then, as my former neighbor said, find your free.
I love that. Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you for doing this. Please come to Detroit. We'd love to see you in person.
I would love to come to Detroit. It's been a long time since I've been to the Motor City. Like I said, you know, I was there back in the 80s, 70s and 80s. It's been a long time since I've been through there. So.
Come. We've got good food. We've got lots of restaurants.
Yes, absolutely.
You have an invitation from us both.
Awesome. You never know. I might out to Source Books. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank both of you for this wonderful, taking the time to have this wonderful conversation, for making us think really deeply and really, intentionally about this book, and about the topics around this book. And so I just want to give a call to action here as we end, that we have Eating Well Black at Source Booksellers, at Source Booksellers and sourcebooksellers.com. Online.com, and you can also purchase it from any independent bookstore. We would be happy with that, but make sure that you get your copy and enjoy it and share it with others. So thank you both so much, and we're celebrating the release and the continued reading of Eating While Black.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Bye-bye.